Hello students, in this lecture I will be covering Aquinas' teachings on happiness found in his work the Summa Theologiae in the first part of the second volume, questions 1 through 5. This lecture will focus primarily on question 1. I will go through the articles of question 1 in detail, and then I will give overviews of questions 2 through 5. If you hear any noise in the background, that is my toddler. Alright, let us look at the structure of Aquinas. It's his writings. So Aquinas wrote his Summa Theologiae following the disputation format. Articles have 4 parts: objections, sed contra, which is an argument from authority, meant to dispose, it's a rhetorical device meant to dispose readers to his position. The main section, the response or I answer that, and then applies to the objections. So the objections here represent common or important positions with which Aquinas disagreed, but he wants to be able to address them. The heart of each article is in the respondeo. So that's where you'll find Aquinas' full position, along with his replies to the objections, where he might develop this or add some further nuances. So in the Summa Theologiae, Prima Secundae question 1, we see there are 8 questions, and we will go through these in order. So first, does it belong to man to act for an end? So are human acts teleological or directed towards an end? So Aquinas argues that an action is defined as human if it is proper to a human being, and an action is proper to human beings if it is performed with reason and will. Actions that you perform that don't involve your reason and will are not called properly human because they're not done in a human way. Aquinas instead says that they are called acts of a man rather than human acts. So they are acts performed by someone who's human, but your humanity is not necessary for the performing of the act. So an act such as sneezing is not something that you do voluntarily. It's something that you do in virtue of your nature, being an animal which can sneeze, but it's not something you choose to do, so we would not call that a human act. And morality concerns human acts. The next point that Aquinas wants to make is that actions are defined by their results. That is, we understand the kind of action you performed by what the result of the action is. And on top of this, he says, since actions are defined by their results, and the will, all voluntary actions, seek goodness, we see then that all human actions are directed to an end, namely goodness, since the human actions, are defined by their results. So all human actions are directed to an end. They are end-directed actions. And therefore, we judge actions based off of the ends that they are directed to, and we judge individuals based off of the ends that they choose to seek. If they do not choose to seek what is properly good, we would say the action is bad. Aquinas then adds in Article 2 that it is proper for rational nature to act for an end. So he first states that humans, like all natural things, act in determinate ways proper to our nature. So our actions are defined by their end results. And human actions, that is deliberate voluntary actions, as we said, are for the sake of an end, because deliberation and choice are natural to man, as we proved in the previous article. So since our powers are naturally ordered to an end, it's natural for us to act for an end. However, the difference is that unlike irrational creatures, the ends which we act for are chosen by us. That is, we are in control of our actions and we direct ourselves. Because we can direct our own actions, we therefore need to know what the good is that we seek. Aquinas then gets into the issue of whether actions are specified by their end. So to be specified means to be defined. So when we go in and examine different types of activities, we need to know how to judge them. How do we define them? How do we determine the kind of act that is being performed? And Aquinas says we look at human acts as defined by the end. So what results from the action, and what is the thing which you act upon? So he gives us 2 ways in which powers can be distinguished. Powers are distinguished by the activities that result from their use. So we have passive powers, like sight, where we don't actively perform something and produce a result state, rather we are acted upon. So I see by light hitting my eye, and it's the result of being acted on that the activity of sight is present. So passive powers are defined by the state brought about and by the thing that brings about the state in us. So sight is distinguished from hearing as a kind of sense, because sight is a state of sensing caused by light. Hearing is a state of sensing caused by sound. Active powers, on the other hand, are defined by what is produced by the activity. So, for example, we distinguish our power of nutrition from our power of growth and development by looking at what results. So, from eating, we say that with our power of nutrition, we replenish the body's energy, we repair the body, we sustain our life, as opposed to growth, where we become bigger. So we would say that there's a difference between just nourishing the body and growing, and those are different powers because they have different proper results. So all human actions are defined and therefore judged by the ends that they achieved. And insofar as, now there's one other point that Aquinas brings up, is that actions can be judged both by their proximate and their remote ends. So we say, what state or what result does an action directly bring about? And we can judge the action based off that state. But we can also judge it by the remote end. That is, if we are ultimately motivated and act in order to achieve goodness, does the action that we perform help us to achieve goodness ultimately? So is this act a means to the end of goodness? If it's not, we would say it's not good. If it is a means to the end of goodness, then it is good. So Aquinas then considers whether there's one last end of human life. And you might be noticing that this is very similar to the points that Aristotle went over in Book 1 of the Ethics. And that is definitely the case because Aquinas was very much influenced by Aristotle. So Aquinas gives us the following argument. He says, there cannot be an infinite chain of motivations or ends for human actions. This is because if there were an infinite chain of motivations or ends, then we would not ultimately ever act, because we would never have an ultimate reason for doing anything that we do. And when we choose to act, we begin with a goal and work backwards. But we always say, why do I want this goal? Now, if it's not, that goal is not directed towards some ultimate last goal, we'll have an infinite chain, and all the actions will be pointless. So if we remove the ultimate purpose of action, all other actions be pointless, so therefore there must be some ultimate goal. And we understand this goal as the very nature of the good. Therefore all human actions are directed towards goodness. Now as far as the question of how many ends there are, as far as how many goods we might seek, Aquinas then considers whether it's possible for us to have several ultimate goals. Now, Aquinas gets into some detail here, and so I want to go in particular into some detail on this because this lines up with what Aristotle treated in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 2. So Aquinas argues first that everything desires its own perfection. Everything is inclined towards its own perfection. And so if there are many things required for perfection, then there will not be one truly last end of human action. That is, if being perfect consists in checking off several boxes, not the means to perfection, but the ultimate state of being in perfection consists in a heterogeneous group of things, then we will not have one last end. Now Aquinas says that nature only tends to one last end, and our will, our rational power of desire, is natural, and therefore it can only have one last end. So we naturally desire goodness, and since goodness is the proper thing that we desire, our proper end is goodness. Now, of course, we still need to get into what goodness consists in, but the idea that something could be desired for a reason other than being good, Aquinas thinks is false. So, because of this, since voluntary actions, as we said, are defined by their ends, all voluntary actions must have something in common to be defined as voluntary. They would not be called voluntary unless there was a commonality. Now, if there were different ends which we sought, in human action, with voluntary actions, then there would be different things that would define our actions, and thus we would not have a universal definition of voluntary that applied to all actions equally. We would instead have pleasure-seeking actions and wealth-seeking actions if those were two distinct ends, two distinct ultimate goods that we sought. So there must be something common to all of our actions in terms of their goals. Aquinas says, since all human actions to be voluntary must be defined by the same goal, therefore they can only have one last end that defines them as voluntary and human. Quote, now, as the last end of man simply as man is to the whole human race, so the last end of an individual man is the individual. Therefore, just as of all men there's naturally one last end, so the will of an individual man must be fixed on one last end. So Aquinas' point here is that human beings in general, our natures are defined by being ordered to one proper goal of goodness and happiness. And since all human beings are defined this way, each individual, regardless of what he thinks happiness is, can only ever be acting for one ultimate goal. Now the next question is everything chosen in order to achieve this ultimate goal? And Aquinas says yes. So he goes through with this argument. All actions are directed to our ultimate goal. They're defined and judged by whether they help us to achieve this goal. So that's what we were saying previously. Now, we all necessarily desire our own perfection. Nothing desires its own destruction or its own maiming. Everything that we want, we think will make us better. Now, any action we perform will either help achieve or hinder from achieving this goal. Therefore, since actions are only performed for some purpose, there's only one ultimate purpose. All actions are for the sake of our ultimate purpose as human beings. We might think that we perform different actions for different reasons, but ultimately, Aquinas says, our reason to perform any action is because we think in some way it is good and will help us achieve perfection and goodness. Now, our perception as to what is good might change, and therefore we might will different actions for different ultimate goods, different ultimate conceptions of the good, but that involves a change in our perception, not in the actual nature of goodness. Aquinas then concludes by asking whether all men have the same last end. So whether there's a universal good which is the same for all people, and thus there's a universal standard against which we should judge all human actions. If there is, then we can have the universal science of ethics, which will allow us to judge and understand what is proper for us to do, no matter who we are, no matter what the circumstances are. It will give us a foundational principle. So, Aquinas turns and looks at the fact that we have a So Aquinas points to the universality of human nature. Now, since all human beings are creatures with free will who act voluntarily, and we all have a will that is naturally ordered to the good, we must all have the same end. Otherwise, our actions wouldn't be voluntary in the same way my actions are voluntary. And if your actions aren't voluntary in the same way that my actions are voluntary, then your nature would not be the same as my nature, and you wouldn't be human in the same way that I'm human, which is to say, one of us isn't human. Now, it's true, however, that people disagree what the ultimate purpose of life is. But even if we disagree, that doesn't change the universality of human nature. The universality of human nature means that whatever my nature is naturally directed to, your nature will be naturally directed to that thing too. Therefore, we will both have the same ultimate end of perfection as human beings, despite whatever differences there are between us, and despite differences in opinion. So disagreements about the ultimate purpose of life don't change the fact that there is only one ultimate purpose of life, which is founded in our human nature, our shared nature, as opposed to just consensus about what it might be. Alright, I now want to go through a little more quickly Aquinas' other 4 questions in this reading. So, next is question 2, and in this, Aquinas considers what happiness might be. Now, this should once again recall what Aristotle argued in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So he considers whether happiness consists in wealth, honor, fame, or glory, power, in physical goods, in pleasure, in goods of the soul, or in any created good. And when he's asking this, he's asking, is happiness solely consisting in wealth? Is the reason why we do all our actions to be wealthy, or is the reason why we do all our actions to be honored, or is the reason why we do all our actions to be famous or to be powerful, or are all of our actions ordered to some physical good, or are all of our actions ordered to pleasure, or are all of our actions ordered to some good of our soul, some intellectual good? And last, is the universal good created? That is it God, or is it something that we can attain directly in this life, some physical state? So Aquinas overall argues that none of these are the case. So happiness does not consist in wealth, honor, fame, power, physical goods, or pleasure. He follows the same reasons, namely that wealth is, first of all, a means to an end. No one seeks to be wealthy in order to just possess money. We want to be wealthy in order that we can spend that money. If you have money and you don't spend it, it's rather worthless to you, since you're not actually using it for what it helps you achieve. So wealth can't be the ultimate purpose of life, because it's a means to an end, not an end in itself. Honor, as Aristotle pointed out, and Aquinas agrees, can't be the ultimate good for two reasons. One, honor and fame are dependent on other people. If other people decide that you're no longer honorable, they change their opinions about what's honorable, then you cease to be honorable in this sense. Same thing with fame. I think we all have heard that Andy Warhol statement that everyone in the future will have their own 15 minutes of fame. Well, obviously fame is not something lasting, and it's very hard for most people to achieve. It also is not a permanent state. It's something which, once achieved, we say, does not really last, because it's dependent on other people caring about who we are and paying attention to us. I think we would also recognize that you can be famous for things that aren't necessarily good. Although Paris Hilton is famous, she's famous for rather bad behavior. I don't think we would say that that really is the ultimate goal of life, is to just be well known. The other point, as I said, the other point that he makes here about honor is that honor seems to be something that follows upon goodness. We honor people who are good, and so if we're seeking goodness as our ultimate goal, it seems honor would be something that follows upon it, but isn't the ultimate thing that we're seeking. We seek to be honored for being good, but what we really want there is the goodness which honor is given for. Power is likewise not the ultimate goal, because power is something that must be used, and it can be used well or it can be used badly. Physical goods likewise are things which cannot last and which oftentimes are used in order to achieve some further end. Last, pleasure, and this is an interesting one. Pleasure cannot be the ultimate good of life for two reasons. One, pleasure is fleeting and temporary. So in that sense, pleasure can't be the ultimate good. Moreover, I think we would say that we seek to feel pleasure because we think when we feel pleasure, then we'll be happy, that pleasure will make us happy. So pleasure would seem to be a means to an end. Secondly, Aquinas says that pleasure is something that follows upon doing something good or the achieving of something good. So if you take great pleasure in a job well done, right, the pleasure is a consequence or an effect of doing a job well. And so your ultimate goal then is to do the job well, and the pleasure that follows upon it is a side effect. So although pleasure will accompany the ultimate good, it does not constitute the ultimate good, but properly constituted is an effect of it. So the ultimate good will therefore have to be something belonging to us, and not just to our body, but belonging to us in terms of our soul, which is the principle of life. But it will not be something of the soul. It'll rather be the attainment of something that we use, the attainment of something which we attain using our human powers, which Aquinas defines as powers of the soul. So he finally argues that the ultimate good is something universal. Since we desire the universal good, the ultimate good must be universal. However, no created thing can be universally good. The only thing that is universally good is God. So Aquinas ultimately says that the ultimate good which we seek in life is God. And so all of our actions should be directed towards attaining God, and all bad actions direct us away from God. Next, Aquinas gets into considering the nature of happiness, the nature of this state of attaining the ultimate good. So he asks first whether happiness is created or uncreated, and if it's created, is it an operation? He then considers several things which we're not going to get into in detail, whether it consists in the sensitive or the intellectual part, if it's an operation of the intellectual part, is it an operation of the intellect or the will, what kind of operation of the intellect it is, and what kind of intellectual content we are considering. So Aquinas will ultimately argue that ultimate goodness, what is ultimately perfective of us, is that which fulfills us in our fully human capacities. Now, there are two ways to consider happiness. What is it that we are seeking, and what does it look like when we've attained the goal that we are seeking? So for Aquinas, what we are seeking is the ultimate good, which is God. So since our will desires good, and the ultimate object of our desire is the source of goodness, God, the object, the goal, is God. However, what does it mean to seek God? Aquinas then says, well, we must consider that attaining and enjoying our goal consists in an operation of the soul. That is, the act of knowing and loving God. He then distinguishes between two kinds or states of operation: perfect happiness and imperfect happiness. Perfect happiness consists in the full perfection of our nature by being fully fulfilled. And the idea of perfection comes in this way. If we think about ourselves right now, think about yourself right now as you listen to this. You have different powers. However, you may not be exercising those powers. I assume that you're probably not riding a bicycle as you listen to this, yet you have the power and capability to do so. So there's a distinction between having a power and using the power, performing the operation. The performing of the operation is considered to be a greater perfection than merely having a skill. We say that it's one thing to have a skill, it's another thing to use it. There's not much point in having a skill if you don't use it. And we say there's more perfection when you use your skill than when you just possess the skill. So in the same way, God, who Aquinas tells us is good and the source of all truth, will be the object of our happiness. And obtaining happiness consists in knowing and loving God. This is because if God is truth and our intellect seeks truth, our intellect properly knows truth, to know God is to know the source of all truth. And therefore, this is what will fully perfect our intellect, because we will be obtaining that which is the source of all things that can be known. So it's most perfective to know the ultimate cause than it is to know effects of the ultimate cause. Likewise, to know and therefore to love goodness itself is to fully perfect us, because anything that we love, any good that we love, is good insofar as it comes from God, Aquinas says, because the cause is greater than the effect. And so if the object of our will is goodness, it will most be fully perfected in its operation when we are directly loving and knowing that which is the cause of those objects which we properly consider. So, he says, happiness is a perfecting operation proper to us as rational animals. The proper activity of reason is knowing truth. So therefore our intellect can only be fully perfected by obtaining and knowing the cause and source of all truth. However, Aquinas doesn't think that we can obtain perfect happiness in this life. Hence, he deals with the idea of imperfect happiness. Now, the idea of imperfect happiness is the happiness that Aristotle was talking about in the Nicomachean Ethics. It's the degree of happiness that we can attain while we are alive. Now, it's called imperfect because it is not complete. The knowledge which we can gain while alive with our limited powers, and the goods which we can attain, and the good things that we can do, and furthermore our relationship with God, is going to be indirect. So any goods that we have are going to be imperfect, and they are called good insofar as they resemble that perfect state. Therefore, since we have a limited ability to be perfected in this life, we are happy only insofar as our activities share in this state of perfect happiness. And therefore, the actions that perfect us to the greatest extent possible by living contribute to imperfect happiness, or constitute this imperfect happiness. So our goal in this life is to seek happiness to the greatest degree possible now this is where we get a little theological, with Aquinas says the goal of being properly disposed such that we might be perfectly happy after death. Having stated all this, Aquinas then considers what is necessary for happiness. So he looks at a list of different things. So he divides requirements into what is needed for perfect happiness and what is needed for imperfect happiness. And here are the following things that he considers. Is pleasure or delight necessary for happiness? Is contemplation of the truth necessary for happiness? Is a rightly ordered will necessary for happiness? What about bodily activity and perfection? What about external, that is, physical goods? And last, what about friendship? So going through each of these in relation to imperfect and perfect happiness, Aquinas answers as follows. Delight and pleasure is required not as a cause but as a result for both imperfect and perfect happiness. That is to say that if you do a good deed, it should be pleasant to you. You should love it, and you should find delight in having done it or in doing it. Now, if you do something good, but you don't actually enjoy it, then you are not quite at that state of perfect happiness, because you're not exactly choosing it fully because it's good, nor do you have a virtuous disposition that enables you to properly perform it. So Aquinas thinks that pleasure or delight should arise from performing good actions and from doing things that are perfect for us. So it's necessary, but it's necessary as a proper effect of it, rather than as the actual state, or as a cause. Next, Aquinas considers contemplation. Now, contemplation, given what we said earlier about our intellectual nature, is necessary for happiness. It's necessary for happiness because to be fully perfected as human beings, we must perform operations and be perfected in the operations that are most distinct of us as human beings, namely reasoning and willing. So to be fully perfected, we must have contemplation of the truth and of goodness. Plato talks about this in his many dialogues when Socrates constantly reiterates that the philosopher seeks the beautiful and the good, kolon ka agathon. So contemplation of the truth is necessary for perfect happiness, because if you are not contemplating the truth, that is, if you are not reflecting and knowing the ultimate good and true, namely God, then you are not really perfected in your nature. So if that's not there, you cannot be perfectly happy. What about in this life, though? Aquinas thinks that it is important that we try to contemplate the truth, but it's not necessary for imperfect happiness. That is, you don't have to be contemplating the truth at all times in this life, since one, it's not possible for anyone to spend all of our time in contemplation. It's just not physically possible. There's not enough hours in the day. We have other needs. We need to eat. We need to sleep. We need to provide. We need to work in order to obtain food and drink and shelter. Further, some people just don't have the mental ability, perhaps, to contemplate the truth for long periods of time. So, for Aquinas, the important thing is our disposition towards the truth in this life. We must recognize the goodness of truth in contemplation and never despise it. Even if we can't always do it, or we're not particularly good at it, that doesn't mean that we can't be happy in this life. That disposition, however, will allow us after this life to be properly disposed, and therefore to be receptive of the gift of true contemplation, and the divine beatific vision. So, now, he adds then our will and our desires are necessary for happiness, insofar as they must be properly ordered to achieve both imperfect happiness, and they must be present if we have perfect happiness. So, what Aquinas means is that if we are going to be happy in this life, we must be choosing to do good things and be desiring to do good things. If we don't desire what is good, we are not going to be inclined to perform good actions. Likewise, if we don't actually perform good actions, that is, our will is not actually present there, then obviously we will not be happy. Now, the presence of willing and desire and proper desire are necessary for perfect happiness, but that's insofar as loving the truth and desiring the truth are going to be present if you have obtained your goal. Aquinas then considers the body. He says that the body is necessary for imperfect happiness in order to gain knowledge and to act rightly. I can only perform acts of virtue using my body. I can't be just by thinking about things. I must actually be just in physical interactions with other people. However, for perfect happiness, insofar as it involves the direct vision of God, it does not require the body, because the body is not necessary to know God directly, since that is not achieved through our senses or with any material organ. But the body is necessary insofar as the complete perfection of the person will involve a perfection of the body. And this is a philosophical basis upon which we can argue for the plausibility or the appropriateness of the resurrection of the body. External goods, as might be clear, are necessary for man to achieve imperfect happiness. We need food, we need drink, we need tools in order to both sustain ourselves and in order to do good deeds. But they are not required for perfect happiness, since God alone suffices and God alone acts on us for that. And friendship, lastly, is definitely necessary for imperfect happiness, because friends provide us an opportunity to do good and they aid us in doing good. They are not necessary for perfect happiness, insofar as perfect happiness does not consist in a communion with friends, but rather in direct knowledge of God. But they are appropriate. They conduce to the well-being of happiness, Aquinas says. Last, in question 5, Aquinas considers what happiness is and our relationship to it. So, can we obtain happiness? Can one man be happier than another? Can anyone be happy in this life? Can we lose happiness? Can we obtain happiness all on our own, or do we need divine assistance? And do we obtain happiness through the action of some higher creature, such as God or an angel, assisting us? Are any actions of man necessary in order to obtain happiness of God? And last, does every man desire happiness? This goes back to what we were saying earlier. So, this is going to be our last slide here. So Aquinas says that happiness can be obtained insofar as we have the capacities necessary to perform the activities that will perfect us and make us happy. So knowing and desiring the universal and perfect good is what happiness ultimately consists in for Aquinas, and in this life performing actions that dispose us and help us to obtain and know the universal and perfect good in all the aspects of our life. If we have the power to perform those actions, then it definitely is true that we can be happy. And Aquinas holds that every human being has the power of reason and will, no matter what their bodily or mental state may be. Now, happiness does admit of degrees. One person can be happier than another in this life, so as one person performs just actions, is better disposed to perform just and good actions than another. So too, Aquinas argues that when it comes to perfect happiness, if one person was more disposed to God and to the good, then he will be more able to participate in that goodness than another. Now, can we be happy in this life? The answer is yes, but with qualifications. Qualifications are twofold. One, we cannot be perfectly happy, as we were saying before, because the restrictions of bodily activity. Bodily actions can never fully fulfill us. We can never know the full truth on our own. We also can never achieve perfect happiness in this life because of the restrictions of our physical nature, which take us away from those activities that most fulfill human nature and most perfect human nature. Furthermore, happiness in life can be lost or diminished by impairment or by turning away from the good. So if someone chooses or gets distracted from pursuing the good, then obviously if he is corrupted, he can lose happiness. Or if you have some physical injury or some tragedy happens to you, that will impair the degree to which you can be happy in this life. However, for Aquinas, happiness in this life is not the ultimate happiness. What is important is that we pursue and dispose ourselves towards the good. So even if we cannot exercise our powers as fully in this life as we would like, we are still disposed so as to be able to exercise them in the next. He says that we can obtain perfect happiness using our natural powers insofar as we can naturally perform actions which participate in perfect happiness, that is, actions which are like perfect happiness or which resemble it. So we can contemplate truth in this life, we can pursue knowledge, we can love each other and do good deeds to each other, and by doing good in that way, it is like we are doing good unto God. However, we cannot be perfectly happy on our own, because perfect happiness requires the beatific vision, which we cannot achieve by our own power. Aquinas concludes by showing that it's necessary to perform good works in order to be happy. If we don't perform good works, we will not develop habits, the virtues that dispose us to the good. And if we're not properly disposed to the good, then we will not be receptive of the good after we die. So he says, all people do desire happiness by our nature. We all are inclined towards goodness. However, not everybody actually desires the true good. This arises either because of vice or because of mistakes in reasoning about what happiness consists in. Alright, thank you very much for watching this lecture. Please be sure to do the accompanying assignment.